Hello, welcome back. Now, what we're going to be doing is exploring how culture, in a sense, either enables or impedes agile ways of working. And this particular section, we're talking about organizational agility, and it's mostly inspired. The approach we use in the Agile Leadership Journey is mostly inspired through this work by good colleagues James Copleen and Neil Harrison. And it's called Organizational Patterns of Agile Software Development, although written in a sense talking about how the design patterns in software actually have a correlation to the design patterns of people and organizations. And for me, this was a sentimental shift in my mindset from coming from that engineering background where I was designing systems and how do you design and architect effective, efficient, fast, scalable software systems, and how that can apply to effective, efficient, scalable people systems in which organizations are. And what they did in this book, which was fascinating, is draw a comparison to the way we optimize technical systems and the way we optimize people systems is symbiotic. There's a tight correlation between there. And so whether or not you have a technical background isn't really required here. What I want you to recognize is that the principles around optimizing flow and optimizing work and optimizing people can be drawn from the engineering world in software development. And so I'm just going to be using that as inspiration, not that you need that background. So I'm going to contrast two different approaches here in a sense of what we call the outside-in approach, which is essentially the typical approach that we see, with an inside-out approach, which is something that we find to be quite more effective in the way we've seen Agile adoption and organizations sustain and grow agility. But let's start with the typical way, the outside-in approach. And so when we think about this, we think about, how do we often start with Agile is we tend to take and gravitate to one of the Agile methods, a Kanban, a Scrum, or something like that. And we say, well, let's just do Scrum. And what we end up doing is we end up in a sense, changing behavior of the people. We put people on a team and we say, okay, you guys are going to follow these new rules. And then we put into place a particular role we call the Scrum Master for Scrum or whatnot. And one of the things I'll ask Scrum Masters, we taught Scrum Mastership for many years, and we say, one of your jobs is to remove impediments for this team as they're running into impediments. And so we'll ask them, what percentage of impediments that you run into on your Scrum teams that you and the team can solve, can you fix on your own? And that number, not surprisingly, comes out really, really small, 5%, 0%. If it's not called an impediment if you can't, fix it in a sense. And so what we're finding is most of the impediments in the organization, that this team runs into are in the organization itself. And what we see then happen is as we try to get some more agility in the organization, as these teams try to become more agile, we tend to see that they hit this agility limit. And this limit is embedded in the organization. And you can kind of define this as, this is what we do around here. And, you can start to see, roles and responsibilities, how people are aligned and what they do might limit their ability to work in these cross-functional teams. The budgets and the sign-offs and some of these policies that we have in our organizations are been defined for decades. And now what we're starting to see is Agile's coming in with a new game. It's saying, those contracts that you have, that's all good, and those plans that you have, that's all nice. But we want to adapt. We want to talk to our customers. We want to, in a sense, respond to these new changes. Yet this is counter to the way the organization is defined. This is counter to the way we do things around here. And so what we find is there's really kind of three different levers that are happening here. We have what we call our structures, roles, responsibilities, departments. We have our policies. These are our rules, our governance, our sign-offs and budgets, and the way we define different milestones. And then we've got these metrics and measures that are essentially driving certain behaviors and what we find to be important. And in a sense, what we find is that these layers, this structure, policy, metric layer, has been built to protect our values. Think of this a little bit like a bank vault protecting your valuable money. In fact, money is a great value. Every company needs money to survive and succeed, pay your employees, share with your shareholders. And we've built this vault to protect our values. We built this layer that's protecting our values. And, whether it's money, and we've got, the chief financial officer, the financial departments, the budgets and what people can spend and sign off authority, whether it's quality, as a value and how we protect that with quality departments and quality policies and how we measure quality through the organization. Take any of these values and we've built up these layers to protect those values. And so what we find is that the agile values that are coming in, and it's kind of this, we think agile is just a process, but it's not. It's much more than that. Agile is coming in as a set of new values, and these are not aligning to the organizational values. And so we're starting to see now this correlation between the agile values and the organizational values and culture, and where that's coming apart. So now what I'd like to do is counter this. Okay, so if that's providing us just a limited agility, how do we break through this? How do we, in a sense, improve our ability to increase agile ways of working in an organization? And so what we call this an inside-out approach. Now, what I don't want to say is we're going to come in and change culture. Now, in fact, one of the ways you can visualize culture is a little bit like a shadow. Think about, in a sense, when I have a shadow, we've got a light source, we've got an object, and we've got a shadow. The way you change the shadow isn't to just, hey, shadow, move or try to move the shadow. You've got to either change the light source or you change, the object. And it's a lot easier to change you than the light source. And so what we talk about here is we're going to be changing this structural layer, these structures, these policies, these measures. This is the layer that we're going to be changing to shape culture. Okay, so culture initiatives, culture change is something that experts say will take a decade or more. We're going to come in and we're going to find these structural changes that are going to start to shape culture. So how do we do that? First, what we want to do is we want to align to culture. Now, we'll get a little bit more into this later. What does alignment mean? But essentially, we want to be careful not to shock the system too much. We've got to be able to come in with something that is going to be relatively well received. And then what we're going to be doing essentially is this middle tier, the structure, the policy metrics, this middle tier now that in the outside in became our obstruction. That was our inhibitor. In this inside out, it's our enabler. It is the place that we're going to either build some agile value-based structure, policy, metrics, or we're going to have to break some of these down to enable more agile ways of working. So essentially, what we're going to be talking about is how to, in a sense, raise this agility limit in our organizations through these structure, policy, metric changes that are going to increase, sustain, grow our ability to use agile ways of working. And just to give you maybe one example of how this plays out and how simple this can come across, imagine a Scrum team. And in a Scrum team, we have this concept of a sprint, this 2-week cycle. At the beginning of a sprint, we do a sprint plan. And at the end of that sprint plan, the team commits. They commit to that plan. Or a lot of teams commit. Now, at the end of a sprint, we do a review. And at the review, we share with stakeholders how we did, how did we get done, how did we do towards our commitment. And let's say the team says, we got 70% of our commitment done. And stakeholders are like, whoa, that's not good enough. You committed to this. This means that this should have been important to you. You should have done everything you could to meet that commitment. And so the stakeholders push back and say, do better next sprint. What does better mean? Now, better might mean, in a sense, that it means meet your commitment. Let's get it closer to 90 or 100% commitment. So what's the team do? What impact, what behavior change does that have on the team? Well, likely what that's going to do is they'll most likely, if they're allowed to, lower their commitment. Now, what we see by this is, in a sense, we see a pull towards what we call more of our control culture, meaning that I'm going to be safer, more repeatable, more predictable, but likely slower than I would if I left that alone. And now I take another team that does Scrum and that does their sprint and sprint plan. At the end of sprint plan, they don't create a commitment. They create a forecast. Now, a forecast is something that could be changed. It's a guess. It's an educated guess. It's a smart guess. And in a sense, it gives the team some flexibility, increasing their ability to adapt and likely pushing them to be able to say, well, wait a second, let's stretch ourselves. And what we find is teams that use the word forecast, because at the end of the sprint, 70% is actually a meaningful metric, and it's useful metric, that will allow a team to have a little bit more creativity and a little bit more speed, competitiveness in our culture framework, that allows them to move a little bit more faster and not necessarily reduce predictability. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But this is how just a single word, how it turns into a policy, the word commitment, and how that could pull towards one more control culture, or the word forecast and how that pulls and draws a little bit more towards a creative and a competitive culture. This is how just a single word and policy can drive behavior change. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be exploring things like roles and responsibilities and these policies, and even how a measure, a metric on a team will drive culture change, drive behavior change. And we'll be talking about how organizations have used these simple tweaks into the organization. This does not mean to be massive organizational restructuring. And that's the fascinating part about this, is we can hack in and find simple ways, maybe not simple, easier ways to, in a sense, start to shape your culture towards more agile ways of working. So we look forward to exploring this topic with you a little bit further and sharing with you some of these stories. Thank you.